that it feels like I'm home when I'm here, which is not nothing. So I feel like I can breathe when I'm here too. Something really nice about the atmosphere here. So thank you so much for having me. So the title of my talk, which I've really kind of scribbled together before coming here, is What Cannot Be Taught? And I'm oriented by a question that was posed by Jacques Lacan in 1978, December 22nd, 1978. How does one go about teaching what cannot be taught? How does one go about teaching what cannot be taught? This question occurred approximately 41 years or so after Sigmund Freud's popular statement about the three impossible professions, namely psychoanalysis, governing, and educating, which concerns us. In his 1937 essay, Analysis, Terminable and Interminable, Freud wrote, I'm quoting him, "It almost seems as if analysis were the third of those impossible professions in which one can be sure in advance of achieving unsatisfying results." End quote. We might have been led to conclude that analysis remains in common with the other two, had it not been for Freud's qualification. It almost seems as if, which is not, it is a fact that, or it is true that. It almost seems as if. Invokes a semblance of commonality with the other two, rather than an equivalence. In fact, I think the statement probably demonstrates the extent to which Freud believed that analysis was not very much like educating and governing. In the same essay, Freud portrayed the analyst at times almost as if he were a teacher. He wrote, I quote him, "It is reasonable to expect an analyst, as part of his qualifications, that in certain analytic situations he can act as a model for this patient and in others as a teacher," end quote. This is from the same essay, 1937. So he didn't indicate that the analyst would engage in academic mimicry, but that his teaching would emerge from certain analytic situations. I think a suitable reformulation of Lacan's question regarding what cannot be taught might be, what is possible of teaching with respect to psychoanalytic experience? What is possible of teaching? I think it's not only a suitable reformulation of the question, I think it's also a properly psychoanalytic question, because it doesn't eschew the impossibilities foundational to its experience. You know, when I see this question, when I read it, I detect an unusual hopefulness in Lacan. There's a hopefulness to a question about possibility. How does one go about teaching what can be taught, what cannot be taught? There's a hopefulness, even as he's approaching the last few years of his life. He asked it a few years before he died, maybe 3 years before he died. There's a hopefulness in a question of the possibility of thinking beyond the insularity of the clinical consulting room or the clinical setting. He wasn't content to remain at the limit of what doesn't work and what doesn't make sense. He asked a question concerning possibility. Some philosophers in the room I know, and you might be thinking about Aristotle, he uses it, Lacan's using it a little bit like that, but he does something a little bit different with it. He doesn't shy away from deploying the word possibility, but not just in reference to Aristotelian philosophy or ancient Greek philosophy. He took an interest in the functional value of philosophy. Of possibility, the functional value of possibility, at exactly the same time that he was developing his own psychoanalytic school. It was in the mid-1960s, while he was leading his 11th seminar on the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. In 1964, Lacan's founding act, which was a short text, which you can easily find online, inaugurated his school, and it inaugurated his school with the following statement, I quote, "I hereby found, as alone as I ever have been, in my relation to the psychoanalytic cause, the École Française de Psychoanalyse, and then it goes on from there. As alone as he ever has been in his relation to his cause. In 1967, he shifted from this lonely act, this foundation of a promise for possibility, toward a proposition made within a social bond, within a society. It was a proposition to establish a psychoanalytic device for the transmission of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic experience that he called the pass. And it's in this later document of 1967, his proposition concerning the pass in psychoanalysis, as it's called, that he uses over and over again the word possible and possibility. So from 1964 to 1967, from the lonely founding act, as alone as we ever are in our relation to the psychoanalytic cause, which can sometimes be irritating to us and even make us paranoid. From the lonely act to its social realization, there was the emergence of a possibility. He used the word favorably when referring to this pass because he believed that he discovered an instrument for the transmission of psychoanalytic teaching that remained as close as possible to, I quote him, the cutting edge of psychoanalytic experience, end quote. I'm going to quote a few words from the beginning of his proposition. The psychoanalyst derives his authorization only from himself. This principle is inscribed in the original text of the school and is decisive for its position. This does not exclude the possibility that the school provides a guarantee that an analyst has come out of its training. The school may do this on its own initiative. To me, it's almost as if this statement forms a bridge. It's a bridge between psychoanalytic experience and its necessary realization. I use that Aristotelian word, necessary. Its realization and its defense within a social group, within a social bond, within a society. It hasn't stopped many analysts, in fact, most of them, from finding insights and training in other schools, other institutions, and many of them from unsubscribing from the psychoanalytic school entirely to become a bit like Diogenes, a master of his own satisfaction, indifferent to the social bond. Possibility is on the side of the social bond. This is the social order. This is a realization that I only came to this morning after a long period of wandering through various Lacanian buzzwords and ideas. Lacan added within L'Étoile, text you can find online, quote, there is no universal or universality, there is no universal that does not reduce itself to the possible, end quote. The word possible or possibility occurs multiple times within the proposition from Lacan, but not at all within his lonely founding act. And each time the word was invoked, it was embedded within overarching statements concerned with the necessity of safeguarding the impossible profession of psychoanalysis. This is the function of the school and the product of its teaching. I take as my orientation today that Lacan was actively constructing the possibilities necessary for each one to face up to the consequences of their own psychoanalytic experience. Lacan's preference for the possible perhaps even led him to state that the goal of analysis wasn't to cure, it wasn't well-being, it wasn't to cure individuals or society, it wasn't therapy, it wasn't to educate, it was to produce psychoanalysts. The goal of the teaching of psychoanalysis and the experience of psychoanalysis is to produce psychoanalysts. In fact, psychoanalysis is probably much more interested in what cannot be cured rather than what can be cured. The impossible. The psychoanalyst is the one who inhabits a social bond known as the analyst discourse. It's a discourse that's neither universal nor particular, but for each one in the singular. I just want to summarize because I feel like I'm losing my thread a little bit, summarize what I think I've just said. The psychoanalytic device, known as the pass, made it possible for each one to transmit something of their psychoanalytic experience to a society. And the miracle is that it's also possible for that society to recognize it, or not. There's another passage in the Lacanian orientation, in fact there are many, which caught my eye last night while scribbling these notes. It's from a text by Jacques-Alain Miller titled Psychoanalysis in Close Touch with the Social, which I'll quote at length. So much would have been impossible if we still had as our reference the fossilized concept of the setting, understood only as the consulting room of the practitioner exercising in private practice. Psychoanalysis does not depend upon the setting, but on the discourse. That is, on the installation of the symbolic coordinates by someone who is an analyst, and whose quality as an analyst does not depend on the location of his consulting room, nor the nature of his clients, but rather on the experience he is engaged in. There is an analytic place possible in institutions, end quote. So on the one hand, there's the lonely psychoanalytic experience, and on the other hand, there's the social bond, or what Lacan called discourse. In fact, that's exactly how Lacan defined discourse. He said, discourse is what constitutes a social bond. The two, experience and social bond, converge as a possibility within the analyst discourse. The analyst is situated within a discourse, not a setting, not a clinic. And it means that there's no reason to reject the possibility of analysts in the university. We wouldn't expect them to offer therapy or pedagogies necessarily. They're not interested in establishing the well-being of the institution or the society. And they're not interested in transmitting necessarily knowledge about psychoanalysis. He would be aimed at making spoken interventions. I've actually found that some people are really surprised to learn that psychoanalysts sometimes speak. We're so convinced that all they do is listen. But the analyst is not a function of listening post. The analyst speaks, and speaks with subjective effects. But there are obstacles within the university that make it impossible for an analyst to make interventions there, witness them. Lacan spoke boldly about the antipathy of university and analytic discourses. He also added, late in his teaching, that the university discourse can refresh its teaching by coming up against its own impossibility. Actually, this statement from Lacan remains very unclear for me. It remains an enigma. It could be interpreted in multiple ways. For me, it's an equivocation. The university refreshes its teaching by coming up against its own impossibility. It's difficult for me because it's not clear if he's making a critique of the university discourse or if he's commenting upon the promise of analysis within the university. Is he commenting upon a possibility or not? It's possible that it's not a critique because he said it at exactly the moment that his own psychoanalytic teaching was entering into the university, quite literally. Not his school, his teaching was actually entering into a university in Paris at this time, an educational institute. He even said he was offering a positive report which would allow his experiment to continue, namely the possibility of psychoanalysis in the university. But with the proviso, I quote him, so long as analysis has the freedom to do so. If it ever gets restricted, then out of the university. Exclamation point. It's also unclear for me, and it remains a puzzle, this statement about teaching rubbing up against its impossibility, because It seems to presume that the university discourse is not itself reducible to impossibility. And I'll return to that point momentarily. But there are two different points of departure: a possible discourse rubbing up against its impossibility to refresh its teaching, and a discourse itself being impossible. Those are two different positions. What is impossibility? Lacan defined it in various ways, but I think we're safe to define it quite simply as what doesn't work, has no utility, so it's not practical. It's not a pragmatism. What doesn't work and what doesn't make sense, which amounts to probably the same thing. But it persists, maybe it repeats. In this conception, from Lacan, university discourse interrogates impossibility only to return itself to a prior consistency of knowledge, refreshed. Which explains, I think, why so many dissertations used to accumulate in the appropriately named stacks of the university library in the 1990s, early 2000s, when I was in university. It's not quite like that anymore, because I think paper has given way to bits of energy bursting at the speed of light. And I think it's also not quite like that anymore, because dissertations are now out plowing fields. Causing effects on woofers and speakers. I heard of a guy in Michigan who did his dissertation as a hip-hop album. And they're also out refreshing policy, rubbing shoulders with policy leaders, knowledge translation, and so on. It's always possible that we're all mad. It's always a possibility that we are all mad. I used the universal qualifier all. It would be helpful, I think, to define the scope of madness as delusion. Lacan put it this way, quote, "We are all mad, that is delusional." According to Miller, this statement, which stands actually isolated in Lacan's teaching, he only said it once in the late 1970s, 3 years before his death. "We are all mad, that is delusional." Miller thought that this was Lacan's attempt to dignify madness, not to democratize it, to dignify it, in much the way it would seem that we now talk about in the university depathologization and neurodiversity, and so on. Lacan's statement generalized madness within the domain of the social bond. We enjoy our meanings. They make us giggle. And so do the meanings of other people. They make us giggle. They irritate us. We believe in them or we don't. Meanings do things to us, and we're satisfied in our meanings, not so much in our meetings. Meetings are very Oedipal. They rob us of enjoyment. And we can enjoy our meanings stubbornly, resolutely. It's a fixation. The truth is what we say it is. The fact that we can enjoy our meanings in ways that are at odds with others can seem a bit funny to us and irritating to others. On the one hand, some of my communist friends are intent on instituting, I don't know what to call it, universal madness. And on the other hand, there are others who are perhaps influenced by the dissolution of grand theory over the last 50, 60 years, ever since C. Wright Mills launched his attack against Talcott Parsons. So influenced by this that they would prefer that only some of us be mad, rather than all. This some designates the madness of what Lacan called fraternities, which we could even find in those spaces that I'm tempted to call, because I'm feeling particularly clever right now, encampusments, in the encampusments. It's a madness for some. In fact, an article published a couple days ago, I think in the New York Times, you can go and try and find it if you want, asked the question, are encampments spaces of learning? It's always possible that we are all mad, except that some of us are equally so. I note with interest that Lacan's question concerned how one can teach in the singular. It was a teaching that would neither be universal, it's not for everyone, nor particular, but singular. A singular teaching. I leave that in suspense for now, without at all rejecting the possibility that the classroom could be thought of in the singular, if we absolve ourselves of the impossible common sense sociology which isolates the individual and the social group. What Lacan said in his next statement was, I quote him, "Freud thought that all is but a dream and that everyone is mad, that is, delusional. This is indeed what the very first step in the direction of teaching demonstrates," end quote. For me, it's clear that Freud's teaching tended toward a generalization of madness. I'll give you an abridged proof by demarcating a period spanning roughly 41 years, beginning in 1899 with the interpretation of dreams. Keep in mind, this was a text that introduced madness, the madness of dreaming, the madness that we encounter while we are in the sleeping state. It's a madness of meanings that are being weaved together and fabricated through various techniques of censorship. It's a madness that's only possible when our defenses are lowered and our satisfactions are heightened. It's a madness of the heightening of satisfactions, which is exactly what happens when we dream. We can have more satisfactions because our body is inhibited, among other things, but our defenses go down, so we can enjoy. We enjoy in our dreams. This was the classical Oedipal idea for Freud's. But then Freud discussed the meaningful satisfactions that were elaborated by the dream work during the sleeping state. It even brought Freud to claim, I think with Kant, that the madman is the dreamer awake, which would be the compass, I think, it's my claim, that Freud would follow for the next 40-something years of his teaching. For the remainder of his work, he was really asking, to what extent are waking satisfactions permitted without having to institute fresh repressive measures? It's a question concerning the transposition of dream madness into the domain of waking life. It's about waking satisfactions. Next, Freud began to analyze symptoms, which he found to be satisfactions that were permitted to pass in waking life through the body, without repression. This definition emerges particularly in 1926 in an essay titled Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety. During each phase of his teaching, he was observing the space where madness confronts an impossible obstacle. In the classic dream work, it was the so-called navel of the dream, a space where interpretation can never go. An absolute obstacle, a hole. During the later period, it was the elaboration of a response to Otto Rang's theory of birth trauma, which was the space where our memories could never go, our personal biographies. So much for C. Wright Mill's sociological imagination. We can't get there. It was also there in his analysis of symptoms, where the symptom absolutely resists interpretation and the symptoms persist, as they did with a number of Freud's patients. During each iteration of his teaching, he maintained the possibility of constantly examining these places of impossibility, holes. What happened next? He explored the satisfactions of groups, social bonds, particularly in his theories of sublimation, creative writing, jokes. These are satisfactions that are allowed to pass in waking life. We cannot claim that Freud was a Victorian thinker of repressive sexuality. It's not clear that he was following a repressive hypothesis, because so much of his work demonstrates that he was a prophet of the sex-positive economy in society. The last period of Freud's teaching arrives into a world structured by historical mythologies that he would interpret casually, as if they were elements of a waking dream. Freud used the same tools as the dream work to decipher these mythological meanings. It shows us the full measure of his interest in the meaningful satisfactions of waking life. He attempted to go as far as possible in that direction. During waking life, our lowered defenses and heightened satisfactions can give rise to madness, which can also be a source of the discontents of culture. It's no less true of his analysis of social groups in 1921, his text, analysis of the, what is it called again? Analysis of something of the ego. Group Psychology and Analysis of the Ego, 1921, there it is. For example, in that text, Freud reasoned that individuals in the group were animated by satisfaction. Same thesis as Emil Durkheim, on the margins of all of the early sociologists and philosophers, the post-Kantians, George Simmel with the stimulus shield, and so on. Durkheim called it collective effervescence. I quote Freud, "A social group shows us that individuals can suddenly have weaknesses of intellectual ability, a lack of emotional restraint, an incapacity for moderation and delay, an inclination to exceed every limit." And it goes on and on and on. I wouldn't claim that Lacan followed a different path during his 40-so years of teaching between the 1940s and the 1980s. For example, Lacan's earlier formulations led him toward his unconscious structured like a language, which promoted classical interpretive techniques aimed at repressed meanings for the most part. Next, he foregrounded the symptom as a site of waking satisfactions, while emphasizing its social utility. Finally, during the last years, he turned toward myth, a word which suddenly populated his discourse, alongside another word, which I just mentioned, which I use almost as a synonym, discourse. The word myth is like a key for me. It allows me to unlock his theory of discourse as a theory of madness. Except, unlike the analytic discourse, each discourse believes that it's the truth. Each positions itself as the norm, which makes them norm-ill. Lacan didn't use the word myth synonymously with mytheme, a word that we're quite familiar with, hopefully, I presume, maybe not, I apologize, in the humanities, because his objective wasn't any more the unconscious structured like a language, a linguistic substratum of the world. Maybe that was the position of Roland Barthes, who erroneously believed that myth involved language robbery. There's no theft here. Nothing's being stolen. On the contrary, it seems as though myth demonstrates, or not, that we can be duped by an arbitrary pairing of satisfaction and myth and meaning. Nothing of our satisfaction is ever taken from us. I found a fascinating passage from Lacan's early teaching from his Écrit, written in 1946. I quote it, "Madness is experienced entirely within the register of meaning," end quote. I think it's a lifelong compass for Lacan, and it could be read alongside another statement that closes his teaching. Quote, "The unconscious is precisely the hypothesis that we do not dream only when we are asleep." Okay. I'll return to his school. His psychoanalytic school, it wasn't without some version of what we call a course or a seminar or a semester. It wasn't without a mode of social organization. It was a social bond whose relationship to knowledge was like a whirlwind, one constantly sabotaging various group effects. If I were to provide a pedagogical and political axiom for the impossible, it would be neither hierarchy nor fraternity. It's my anarchist pedagogy. For each theme of study, a singular invention could be recognized or not by the institution. Recognized not for its utility or its meaning, but for its desire to pursue the contours of this impossible endeavor whose compass we have turned ourselves toward. I admire a classroom no longer obliged to follow the normalization of time, one no longer inclined to iron out the wrinkle of any logical unfolding of a teaching which moves according to its own time. There's a moment of understanding. It's true, there is a moment of understanding. It's possible. But I'm convinced that it doesn't happen in the classroom. It occurs after a moment of impact, a moment which the normal model cannot do anything but sabotage. Why couldn't the classroom be punctuated by an impact when it's most likely to resonate? For each interval of time, a punctuation at the moment of resonance, when a satisfaction and meaning can no longer form a couple with one another, so that a new possibility can be carried into the world, into the field, into knowledge. It wouldn't be all that difficult to install the provisions necessary for a moment of impact, scandalous as it would be for the university discourse and all that's now common to the classroom and its function within wider society. Its effect would be undeniable. It requires a few teachers, resolute in their desire, whose training, overflowing from an experience with the impossible labyrinths of thinking, continuously push them to make a mess of things. What is the aim of teaching? Maybe it has nothing to do with the well-being of students or wider society, nor with the transmission of knowledge or skills or know-how, or even with advancing the interests of whatever works. It's all possible, but it seems to me that our profession could be better served by the installation of the very function which we are forced to confront as our question. What is the aim of teaching? Perhaps psychoanalysis remains a possible space of refuge against the pressures that now threaten any possible aim of teaching within the university. Lacan's teaching provides an orientation. He refused to give it to us in the form of a pill. It remains forever unfinished, raw, and it introduces large margins of misunderstanding. There's no way into it. He changed his position frequently, even during the same session, resituating himself with what he thought he knew. In doing so, he reinvigorated the field and kept knowledge moving, and maintained the place from which that movement is possible, an impossible whole. This practice did lead him toward moments of clarity. Unfortunately, many of these moments of clarity have now ossified into Lacanian aphorisms that are now prevalent among internet philosophers. They've become well-worn philosophical, political, and pedagogical treatises. I'll summarize all of this with a simple statement. Lacan's teaching was of boundless possibility. He described his teaching in the following way, I quote, "What I trace in front of you are the very tracks around which I ask questions of myself. Vaguely." It's a personal narrative. "Not my thoughts wander before things eventually become clear," end quote. You will not find a place in Lacan's teaching where meaning settles. It doesn't mean that his teaching doesn't hold together, because he's oriented by his impossible profession. It's his compass. There's life pulsating in every statement from Lacan. During each moment, he was animated by a question aimed at his own impossible profession. He wasn't moved by the cult of whatever works, like the pragmatists who gain ground every day within the university. Nor was he propelled by the discourses of schoolmasters, intent on conveying prefabricated knowledge as if through a radio transmitter. It was during the uprisings of the late 1960s in France that he truly became a sociologist. His founding act established the basis, but first he needed to recognize himself as excluded from the prior discourse, which was the university discourse. It was easy for him, actually, because he was excommunicated. It wasn't his choice. He was excommunicated from the university discourse. He was excommunicated from the International Psychoanalytic Association, the IPA, which had lost its way since Freud. And he was excommunicated precisely because he held firm to his teaching, the moment of impact. It was precisely over the moment of impact, what I've been calling the moment of impact, which is a pedagogical technique used in the clinic that Lacan had developed, that had taken on various pejoratives, such as the short session or the variable length session, which was Lacan's favorite term for it. You end at a moment when it hits. The IPA remained convinced that the proper path was to separate the training of teachers from the experience promoted by teaching. And the way they accomplished it was to sustain an initiatory society upheld by gatekeepers of knowledge at the top. On the other hand, Lacan was confronted, even within his seminars in the 1960s, this is a period of revolutionary upheaval, not unlike our own, by students forming their encampusments, storming into his seminars, asking questions of him, sabotaging his classroom. He was confronted, on the other hand, with the fraternities, the comrades, of which I count myself a member. So the former, the IPA, was a social bond based upon the principle of initiation within a society, and the fraternities was a social bond based upon segregation between societies, between social groups. Lacan's school offered a model that would neither be hierarchical nor horizontal, but a whirlwind. This is how Lacan refreshed the Freudian field. And he wasn't afraid to pull the rug out from the entire thing to start again from nothing, if it wasn't as close as possible to the experience that was supposed to be promoted there. And that's exactly what he did in the 1980s. He famously made a statement about the disillusion of his school. One of his prized colleagues, François Dolto, said, I'm paraphrasing, she said, "How could you do this, Lacan? Your school that you've been working on for 40-something years, your school is you." And he said, there's one problem with that. I dissolved this school. Subject of the sentence. I is a subject of the sentence. To the surprise of everyone, he set everyone free in their relation to the psychoanalytic cause, disrupting the group effect, the transference. And he re-energized the school. A pile of people turned to Lacan to follow him, and he insisted he would never make a whole out of them. W-H-O-L-E. But I think there's many ways to pull the rug. A modest step forward, return to foundations, and pull the rug. I hesitate to mention it, but this was a possibility already promoted by Jacques Derrida. You can always deconstruct the text. These texts and traditions that now inspire the comrades around the world are based upon yesterday's theories of our environment. They've been ossified, taken for granted, perhaps rendered consistent with that environment. We already all know exactly what Marx means by commodity fetishism and alienation. We know it too well. We know what Gyatro Spivak's theory of the subaltern is. Perhaps it's time we stop knowing it. As teachers, Miller said of Lacan that he was always reformulating, remobilizing, and never said "it's ready" about his thinking at any point. Why couldn't our classroom produce a whirlwind of meaning? I think you said I have an hour. I'm going to try and figure out a way to the end. Where is meaning from the perspective of the classroom today? What is the function of the classroom today? Maybe it's the same question, if any, in relation to the world which surrounds it. Does the classroom consist with that world, as in the topology of a sphere? Or could the classroom be conceived as a whole, H-O-L-E, around which the toric world, torus is a donut, spins? These are the sorts of questions that a Canadian pioneer, founder of media studies and media ecology, Marshall McLuhan, was led toward, particularly during the last part of his teaching. He didn't exactly follow the path of topology. But he said in the 1970s, I quote him, "We live in a new environment in which all of the answers are outside of the schoolroom. If the answers are outside, why not put the questions inside? And why don't we set up a dialogue between outside and inside?" End quote. It's a topological question. McLuhan, though, couldn't conceive of a whole, H-O-L-E. He wasn't a topologist. The whole was always covered by a question mark for McLuhan. I went looking for holes in Marshall McLuhan's thought, and all I found is that they were missing. The whole is missing. He was interested in the difference of inside and outside according to the vantage point of teachers, and he saw the world as mad. McLuhan said it like that. He said the world is mad. Like that song by the appropriately band, what is it called? REM? Appropriately titled that. They have a song called Mad World. This was McLuhan's idea. It's at this point my ideas get especially confused, so please bear with me. Today it's the scientific discourse, which is what Lacan called it, that marches straight into the classroom. It's difficult because the university discourse was often thought as to be one of possibility, rubbing up against impossibilities. The scientific discourse, on the other hand, is a discourse of impossibility for Lacan. It has its insights, its formulae, and schemata, and so on. But the classroom is a space increasingly occupied by a strange convergence of capitalism, science, and pragmatism. This is how the impossible rubs up against the university. The impossible, it seems to me now that I've said it, is rubbing up against the university. It's not exactly refreshing. You probably already know that pragmatism emerged in the United States of America as a tradition in the Midwest. It was, from the very beginning, a disruption to epistemologies of truth, which consisted, in some sense, because they were boldly claiming, I'm reducing to the extreme, I'm not a philosopher of pragmatism, so forgive me, but it seems to me they were trying to evaluate truth according to its consequences, its effect. The problem with the pragmatic classroom is that it increasingly topologizes a sphere, suturing the inside and the outside. We lose ourselves as subjects to our environment. There's no place from which to ask the question anymore. Increasingly, we're losing our breathing space. The interior and exterior of the university are becoming continuous without boundary. This is what scares the hell out of me. As the university goes marching outside toward civil society partnerships, toward the promotion of engaged citizenry, and so on, those elements come marching inside. And we lose the space from which any subjective question could ever be sustained. Instead of brushing up against impossibilities, we're becoming devoured by them. What's more is that students no longer seem to bring questions to the classroom, increasingly. It's my prophecy. My prophecy is you will witness the loss of the question in the classroom. Your students will increasingly ask fewer questions. It's not the way it used to be. The professor used to be a subject who was supposed to know something. And the student would come with their question marks to ask, to alleviate their doubt, because students were animated by a desire. It was an Oedipal world. Today, the professors, the teachers are confused. The students know everything. It's not a nostalgia, it's a prophecy, the loss of the question. A question is only possible from the standpoint of subjective desire, which means that something of satisfaction in the student had to have gone missing so that they would want it again, so they could raise a question. Nothing was stolen here. There's no robbery. There's no theft. Satisfactions are heightened in the classroom. Classroom is very satisfying. In fact, I'm thinking spontaneously, I remember many years ago when I was teaching in Michigan, on the student evaluations, one of the things that they could check, as it was a Likert scale, was did you enjoy this class? Yes, I'm going to be measured on your enjoyment of the class. Satisfactions are heightened in the classroom today, increasingly so. It's not an Oedipal world. And the loss of satisfaction is the precondition for any interrogation of masters, whether they be pedagogical, colonial, or political. This new environment, which seems to me to be increasingly impossible, points toward exactly what it was that Lacan foresaw as the consequences of the push of scientific discourse. He said that it would result, I quote, in the relaxation of the university discourse. End quote. This was at the very end of his teaching. It's one of those undeveloped statements. What is relaxed is maybe the question. If students already know everything, the professor doesn't need to know. This is the paradoxical triumph of the university discourse, since it has realized the very impossibility through which it was hitherto animated. It's also, consequently, brought students to the point of certainty. It's our fault. It marks an intensity and qualitative shift in our contemporary discontents. It's the student who's now an expert of lived experience. And what's more, the new pedagogies shift students to this or that place on the discouragingly named field trip, to special regions, monuments, museums, or communities. But those places are also brought into the classroom in our appropriately named playgrounds and D-labs. I encourage you to read an article last week in the New York Times about the trend in the United States. American universities are now quite literally devouring museums. Museums are now going inside of American universities. We're even talking about doing something like that at AKU. Seeking refuge. Learning through doing and service, as in makerspaces, internships, and design thinking has gone mainstream. Educational platforms promote the free reign of insular satisfactions. Worlds of insular meaning where each can say whatever they say and be whatever they claim to be. It's the merging of satisfaction with meaning, permitted within the classroom, without any requirement of fresh repressive measures. Incidentally, the buzz on social media for the last 2 weeks has been about a debate between Gayatri Spivak and a student in India, Delhi, JNU. Spivak insisted on a common language game. Here again, we can see the confrontation of the time between the universality of a discourse and its confrontation or its devouring by the impossible. Okay, just some concluding thoughts. I hope that I've shown some explanation for the claim that I've been sustaining for about 10 years, that we dream outside of ourselves. I was surprised to learn just yesterday that Marshall McLuhan already made this claim, which I thought has been mine all this time. It makes me feel good to be understood, I guess. There is somebody else out there who's in the same language game as me, so we're mad together. Except I would add that what McLuhan couldn't foresee was that knowledge constitutes our environment in a spherical way without bounds. We swim in the boundarylessness of our environment, like a fish in water. Recently, an expert on artificial intelligence asked his audience the following question: how many of you actually make use of artificial intelligence on a daily basis? A few hands went up in the room, and this was supposed to be evidence that it's not as big of a problem as we all think it is, that it's actually quite insignificant. The question already limited the scope of the answer. It presumed in advance that we are separated from our media, and that media is not at all constitutive of the environment. Perhaps what we require is a refresher on media theory. How can we explore the consequence of the claim that artificial intelligence is neither gadget nor tool but environment? How do we do away with this stubborn thesis concerning the utility of media? McLuhan famously said that we shape our tools and our tools go on to shape us. It offers a perspectival shift from media as utility toward media as environment or determinative structure. A place where we might begin could be with the anxiety of the educators, us. It's an emerging anxiety. It's a new anxiety. As a social problem, it's a new social problem for the most part. The anxiety of educators. I can't hear anything but the anxiety of educators for the last few years since artificial intelligence chatbots have hit the scene. It's a signal of something real, impossible. It's a signal of the impossible, this anxiety. It signals something impossible about our profession. It's an anxiety that would be better approached by admitting the question that it forces us to ask: what are the aims of education? Our anxiety slips toward anger, which is an emotion that we might expect when students are plagiarizing or constantly cheating or whatever else. But it also absolves us of having to ask a question about our own teaching. What are the aims of teaching? And it allows us to return to a pedagogy of paper and presume that it's still relevant in a world of bits that travel at the speed of light. The anxiety of educators emerged after the anxiety of scientists. I promise I'm almost at the end. Which Lacan forewarned in the 1970s. It's akin to the anxiety of any impossible profession. I quote Lacan: "There is something Freud didn't talk about because it was taboo for him, namely the scientist's position. It too is an impossible profession, but science doesn't yet have the slightest inkling that it is, which is lucky for science. Scientists are only now beginning to have anxiety attacks." End quote. It's an anxiety that signals something impossible, outside of discourse, which doesn't mean that it's not effective, because it's produced mutations in our discourse, the university discourse. It has done so through gadgets, which allow us to move from science to fiction and so on, and the artificial intelligence chatbot. This shift from the university as possible toward its impossibility brings panic. Are the innovations in the classroom happening faster than we can keep up with them? I quote Andrew McLuhan, Marcia McLuhan's grandson, who recently said to me, quote, "Innovation moves at the speed of light, but regulation at the speed of paper." End quote. I'm thinking about this as plagiarism policies are being developed at Oxbridge and so many other places, which can't do anything. It's too slow. How do you prove plagiarism with AI? That's paper. There's one solution, I think, which the classroom has to its advantage, so long as it keeps one foot in the world of paper. It's the body. The body's not so different from a sheet of paper. I can prove it, I've got tattoos. The body's not so different from a sheet of paper. But the hologram of a body first introduced through the photograph and later into the television set, where we had our first out-of-body experience. The body which sits in my Zoom classroom removes the possibility for teaching. In Mumbai, as I was teaching during COVID, I witnessed a thoughtful student with pensive, furrowed brows, thinking very strenuously on repeat every 15 minutes. It was a hologram. His body wasn't there, so there was no thinking. It's not exactly Descartes. It's post-Cartesian. The body is a precondition for thinking. It's a lesson taught to me by the experience of my patients over the last few years and the newest social movements who go to great lengths to believe in their body. Again, they keep me on my toes, always forcing me to rise up to this cold new environment and to see how they are finding solutions for themselves. I'm going to stop there with unfinished thoughts. Thank you.